Alexei was an ordinary man living a rather unremarkable life. He lived in an apartment building, worked in an office, had friends, and enjoyed spending his free time reading books or playing video games. However, everything changed one day when he accidentally stumbled upon a place no one was ever meant to see. It was a regular day. Alexei was returning home from work when he overheard a snippet of conversation on the bus. "Did you hear? There's an old psychiatric hospital in the city that almost no one knows about. It was closed down 10 years ago. They say terrible things happened there, and now no one dares to go inside." Those words stuck in Alexei's mind. He wasn't one for urban legends, but something pulled him toward it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the boredom that had been creeping into his life lately. He decided to find that hospital and uncover the secrets it held. The hospital was located on the outskirts of the city, in an old and abandoned area that seemed long dead. Alexei parked his car near the massive iron fence surrounding the decrepit building. The wind seemed to whisper warnings, but he ignored them. He slipped through a gap in the fence and approached the hospital's enormous doors. As Alexei entered, he was immediately struck by the wide and empty corridors covered in cracks and grime. Rusted chairs, shattered glass, and scattered papers littered the floor, remnants of a bygone presence. There was nothing welcoming about it, but fear hadn't set in yet. Walking deeper into the hospital, Alexei stumbled upon an old ward filled with broken beds and chains dangling from the ceiling. Silence surrounded him, but he began to feel as though the walls of the hospital were starting to take on a life of their own. There was a strange tension in the air, a sense of being watched. He wanted to turn back, but he couldn't find the way. The corridors began to change, growing longer, and every turn led him somewhere unexpected. That's when Alexei realized he was trapped, and the hospital had no intention of letting him go. With each passing minute, the walls grew more sinister. They seemed to breathe, to move, and the shadows in the corners began to take on human-like forms. Alexei felt an inexplicable heaviness in his chest, and panic began to set in. He could hear whispers, rustling noises, and strange voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Soon he encountered his first resident of the hospital. It was something that may have once been human. The creature was covered in scars, its skin stretched taut over its bones, and its eyes burned with malevolent fire. It scraped against the walls, moving straight toward Alexei. He fled, not knowing where to go. The hospital was disorienting him, and every corridor held new dangers. With every step, Alexei felt the hospital closing in on him. It was alive. It fed on his fear, his desperation. Suddenly, breathing became difficult, as though the very atmosphere of the place was stealing the air from his lungs. After what felt like hours, Alexei found a small room that provided temporary shelter. He slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the floor. Questions began to swirl in his mind. What is this place? Why are there such creatures here? How do I get out? In the corner of the room, he noticed old medical records. They detailed strange experiments conducted on the hospital's patients. Doctors had attempted to treat mental illness through painful and inhumane methods. Patients were strapped to beds, forced into deep psychosis, and their minds were toyed with. Some patients didn't survive, but their souls, it seemed, remained here forever. The records mentioned shadows, beings born from madness and fear. Patients who had suffered too long in this place had lost their humanity, becoming spiritual embodiments of terror and pain. Their bodies had dissolved, but their minds lingered, wandering the hospital, trapping anyone who dared to enter their domain. Alexei began to understand that every step he took was part of someone's design. The hospital hadn't drawn him in by chance. It had chosen him. But why? After several days without food or water, Alexei began to weaken. He felt the shadows watching him more and more. He heard their whispers and felt cold fingers brushing against his skin. It seemed the hospital had no intention of letting him go. He was like a fly caught in a web. One night, when Alexei had all but lost hope, he found a room that was very different from the others. In the center stood an old doctor's table, and candles flickered in the corners of the room. The air smelled of rot and dampness. His body began to tremble. On the table lay old surgical instruments and rubber straps. Everything pointed to this being a place where procedures had once been performed on patients. Suddenly, Alexei heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a man in an old doctor's coat, his face obscured by a mask. The man's eyes were filled with madness. "You've come," said the doctor. "I've been waiting for you. The hospital needs new sacrifices. It must feed. And now you will become a part of it." Alexei began to back away, but his body wouldn't move. Fear paralyzed him. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. The doctor slowly approached, holding up an instrument in his hand. It was an old, rusty saw. "Now you're one of us," the doctor whispered, raising the saw over Alexei's head. At that moment, Alexei felt something cold wrap around his neck, squeezing until it hurt. The hospital consumed him. The walls began to close in, and the room spun around him. And with his last breath, he realized that he had become part of this place forever. Now, like the others, he roamed the hospital's corridors. His body had disappeared, but his mind remained trapped within the endless walls. His soul had turned into a shadow, whispering in the darkness, waiting for the next visitor brave enough to step inside.